In this lecture, we are going to be discussing about Object Relational Mapping, ORM. This is a very important aspect of building an MVC application. An Object Relational Mapper, ORM, is simply a code library that automates the transfer of data stored in a relational database table, such as a MySQL table like the one we created in the last lecture, into an object that are more commonly used in application code. In a more simpler term, it is a technique that lets you query and manipulate data from database using object-oriented programming approach or techniques. If you have built any database-driven application before, you know that the default way for interacting with the database is either to use the MySQLi API or to use the PDO API. And then you need to write all of the SQL queries that you need for the programs to work. Like you want to select items from a table, you want to insert items into tables, you need to actually write out all of the queries. You want to join tables together, you need to write out all of the queries. But using an ORM, the code that is needed to manipulate the data, like query the data, delete data, update data, is already encapsulated in the library so that we don't need to actually write raw SQL anymore. We simply need to interact directly with an object which we create inside of our program. Some of the popular object relational mappers for PHP includes Doctrine and Propel. You can actually do a Google search for Doctrine. So we can say Doctrine ORM. Okay, so this is object relational mapper for PHP. It's a very good one. And then you can also do a Google search for Propel. Right, so you can always visit the website here if you want to learn more about any of these object relational mappers. Okay, so if you're like me, the big question now would be, why should I be using an object relational mapper? I could just write an SQL statement and then get my things done. Okay, so this is good for small projects, but if you are going to be working on a large scale project, then you probably need to use a solution like ORM. One of the advantages of using ORM is that it enforces the principle of dry. Dry means don't repeat yourself. When you are using ORM, you simply create a model in one place, which is easier for you to actually update, maintain, and reuse the code in other places in your application. The next advantage of ORM is the fact that it forces you to write MVC code, which is a much cleaner way and a much better way for you to actually program. So if you have done anything MVC before, you know that it's actually very easy to maintain the code in an MVC application because of the principle of separation of consigns. Why the next advantage that I have here is application maintainability. The ORM library has been well tested by so many developers. If you go to both of the websites that I showed you just now, you can see that there are so many contributors. If you have a chance to look at the GitHub project, you see that there are so many contributors, so many developers have actually tested this. They have tried it to certain levels and see that, okay, this is actually fit for production environment. So you don't need to do extensive testing by yourself. Obviously, you need to ensure that the code actually does what you want it to do for your specific project. And then in terms of refactoring your database schema or your model definition, this can be done easily without even affecting how the data is being used by your application. And so we're going to see more about this later in the course when we actually start implementing this in code. So obviously ORM is going to actually increase your productivity because it makes things much easier for you. All right, so some of the downside to using ORM is in terms of performance. If ORM is not properly configured, it can actually have high performance impact on your application. So this will mean that you need to actually know what you're doing and then you need to learn it properly. The second one is the learning curve, because you actually need to learn how to use it, which may not be easy, okay, in most cases. But if you follow along, I'm going to be showing you all what we're doing step by step and giving detailed explanation as to how to use the application, so this won't be a problem. All right, so let's see a sample ORM code. This is a sample ORM code to create a new user inside of our database. If you're already familiar with object-oriented programming, you know what is going on here. We create a new instance of the user object, and then we set the name property of the user to John Doe. We set the email property of the user to john@example.com, and then we call the save method to actually persist the information in the database. So this is just a basic example of how to insert one record into the database using the ORM concept. In the next lecture, we are going to install an ORM and then set it up in our